Thank you all for joining us today for another episode of our podcast, Moving to Value Unscripted. My name is Dr. John Rodas, and I am a recovering hospital president and am proud to be the president of the Moving to Value Alliance. The Moving to Value Alliance, MTVA, is a 501c3 nonprofit and multi-stakeholder grassroots organization whose purpose, put simply, is to foster high-quality outcomes at a reasonable cost for plan sponsors and their members, beneficiaries, or employees. Our community has grown substantially over the past few years. We started in Connecticut, but now have nearly 1,000 members from more than 40 states across the United States, and our members include many value-based influencers. I want to thank our supporters who make this presentation possible. We'd like to give a special thanks to our trade member sponsor, Connecticut Joint Replacement Surgeons, LLC. We're joined today by my fellow board member, Dr. Steve Schutzer. Dr. Schutzer, a nationally recognized arthroplasty surgeon, is one of the founders of MTVA and is co-founder and president of Upswing Health. We're also joined by Laura Watson, Executive Director of MTA. Laura has a journalism background with experience reporting on healthcare, antitrust, and regulatory news. Our special guest today is Matthew Seiler of the National Community Pharmacists Association, or NCPA. NCPA is the voice for independent pharmacy, protecting and promoting the interests of independent pharmacists. The organization represents over 19,400 pharmacies nationwide. As Vice President and General Counsel, Matt Seiler is responsible for all legal, transactional, compliance, and related activities at NCPA. Matt has extensive experience in the healthcare legal space, and he began his career as a neonatal intensive care nurse. We're excited to hear about the challenges facing independent pharmacies from Matt. Matt, welcome to Moving to Value Unscripted.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
You know, Matt, I'm thinking I'm an old high-risk OB guy, so I'm glad that I never handed you a premature triplet on a Friday night, and then I'd usually go away and leave you stuck taking care of them all weekend. So I suspect our paths have never crossed that way.
But I don't think so, unless you're at the Children's National Medical Center in the late 90s, probably not.
No, not there. So Matt, tell us, how on earth did a NICU nurse, I noticed in life, very few people have straight paths, and clearly yours is not one. How did a NICU nurse become an attorney and get involved in the pharmacy space?
Well, first, thanks for having me on your podcast. These are the issues I think we'll talk about today are issues that people face every single day. And if they don't, they know somebody who is, and that is getting access to the medications they need to be healthy. I went to the University of Michigan and got my nursing degree there and came out and was lucky enough to be one of the first new grads that Children's National Medical Center hired into their NICU in possibly ever. I don't know if they had ever hired new grads. There was a class of 5 of us that they hired into the NICU. And it was an incredible challenge. As a young man coming out of nursing school, having only held a baby once or twice, it was quite an undertaking to really learn how to care for neonates, the complexity of, all of the disease states that they had, issues that they had, from cardiac issues to, just being premature, was really quite overwhelming. And I can't say enough about the nurses that taught me in those few years that I was there and that continued to work there for another, in some cases, like 30 years. And it's just quite remarkable. I went there and I knew that nursing was just going to be the foundation from which I kind of grew my career. And I looked at everything from healthcare administration to an MBA. But ultimately, I chose to go into law because I grew up in a union household and my parents were both very active in their local unions. My mom was a vice president of her AFSCME local, and my dad was a president of his UAW local, both in Flint, Michigan. And I thought to myself, I'm like, there's so many paths I can go with this. I can do labor law. I can do healthcare law. I can, use the background that I had as a nurse to go into healthcare law. And so I felt like, what a great degree to get. And who knows where it will take me. But I did kind of have an idea that being a patient advocate was something I really enjoyed as a nurse. We would have these babies come in, and too often I would hear kind of this rosy picture that would be painted for the parents. And I think it's understandable, right? Like the parents are just scared out of their minds, and your child is facing, in some cases, multiple surgeries and a long time in the NICU. And I really love to advocate for those parents and kind of like really tell them the truth about what's going to happen so that they can be prepared. And that advocacy, I think, is what really drove me to focus on healthcare law. And right out of law school, I I did a little insurance defense work for a firm in Detroit. And I thought it was interesting, but it wasn't really what I wanted to do. I didn't feel like I was having enough impact. And so I was fortunate enough to get offered a job at the American Nurses Association, where I primarily worked with the American Nurses Credentialing Center. So that's an entity that does like the magnet recognition program and accreditation and certification programs for nurses. And it's there where I really got interested in being able to be a general counsel at an association where you could really advocate for patients to get access to healthcare and to really help professionals like providers work within an environment that is supportive of them, that recognizes their value. And so I took a weird path to get to where I'm at. I was at ANA for a few years, and I went and worked for a financial services company that, frankly, I thought I'd only work at for a few years. But I was learning so much, and I had such a great experience there. I ended up staying about 12 and a half years. And from there, I went to the Physical Therapist Association, and then ultimately ended up at NCPA.
Wow. Quite a journey indeed.
It was.
Yeah, like I said, clearly no straight line there.
Yeah.
We've had a boring career, John.
Yeah, I just became a doctor, then became a hospital president. I felt like that seems like a straight line compared to your journey, man. God bless you. So, Matt, let me just start by asking, what your organization advocates for. What do they do? And from our perspective, we see independent pharmacies as being under extreme challenges with, either consolidation in the space by the big Walmarts and CVSs of the world. But despite that, the independent pharmacies still seem to have existed. And then, of course, you have the challenges that the PBMs, that we're learning about how the PBMs have extracted a lot of the money in the pharmacy space and how that's added to the challenges for you guys. So tell us a little bit about what are the challenges you're facing right now.
Yeah, so as you indicated at the beginning of the episode, we represent America's independent pharmacies, which unfortunately right now I think just dipped below 19,000 due to various things that we can get into later. We're losing about 1.5 independent pharmacies a day, 2024. With that, we still make up about 40% of all prescriptions filled in the United States. Between mail order and retail, it still represents about 40%. And any not publicly traded retail pharmacy can be a member of NCPA. So our typical member owns about 2.5 stores. And these are folks that are, your Main Street type of pharmacy you would see maybe in your hometown that you grew up in, or like the inner city that you grew up in. It's your corner store, your corner pharmacy. These are pharmacists that come out of pharmacy school that want to start a small business. Maybe they take over a pharmacy that has been established for a long time. I talked to a gentleman yesterday up in Minnesota. He took over a pharmacy 30 years ago that now has been there over 100 years. And we see that a lot in our industry. It's either family passing it down to each generation, or it's someone who grew up in that community that went to pharmacy school and then ended up buying the practice from the pharmacist that they saw as a child. And so NCPA, we represent those folks by doing advocacy, both at the federal and state level, for passing legislation that would ultimately help those businesses stay strong. Personally, I do advocacy work with state and federal regulators, so like the FTC, the DOJ, and then state AGs across the country. And we also do a ton of education about how to be a good business operator, how to be innovative in the space of pharmacy so that you're a good competitor within that space. And I think we do a lot of really good work that results in some excellent patient care. I think if you were to walk into a CVS or a Walgreens and compare that experience with walking into your local community pharmacy, most patients will tell you that they're getting a better experience walking into the community pharmacy. There have been some studies done. I think J.D. Power and Associates did a study that showed that patients often prefer their community pharmacy because of all the other innovative things that the community pharmacy does, but also that personal touch that they have. They know their community, they know their patients, they remember their names, and it's just kind of service that goes above and beyond.
Yeah, as I recall, it's one of the most trusted professions out there. Steve?
Yeah, Matt, the challenges to the independent pharmacy is coming just at a time where primary care needs them the most. The independent pharmacy being part of the primary care team being integral member, having the value, having that personal relationship. I think that's one of the consequences of this vertical integration and the PBM dominance that folks don't really realize. I'm from West Hartford, Connecticut. It used to have a wonderful independent pharmacy. It sold to CVS. I mean, it changed overnight. There's no conversation with the pharmacists anymore. So you view that as a challenge as well, that there just aren't going to be independent pharmacists to be part of that primary care team.
It is a big challenge, but it's a challenge that NCPA and an organization that we are part owners of, CPESN, are stepping up to the task to meet. CPSN is a clinically integrated network organization that is designed around each state, has its own CIN, where it's all driven by the individual pharmacists themselves to set up these clinically integrated networks so that they are part of the overall healthcare team treating patients. And it is proven to be in some states very, very successful. And you're seeing much better outcomes for patients. And I think the primary care providers are much happier when they have the ability to work hand in hand with the pharmacist.
We often talk about the chronic moral hazard that many primary care docs face because of the challenges of 15-minute visits and RVUs and all that sort of stuff. I would imagine it would be the same thing for a community pharmacist that suddenly has, certain metrics to meet and can't have the conversations. That's probably not why they went into this field.
I think that's right, though I still think community pharmacies do make that time. I use a community pharmacy myself. There's one right here in Alexandria that I use. And, the pharmacist is right there behind the counter. It's a smaller store, so it feels more intimate. Community pharmacies generally don't have the big front end stores like what CVS and Walgreens do. And so I think it just makes for an environment that is easier to interact with your pharmacist or even the pharmacy tech to be able to talk about the medications that you're on, how you're experiencing those medications, and then that feedback can ultimately get back to your physician if there is something wrong. And I don't feel like that's the case many times in some of the chain pharmacies. That's not to say, and I don't want to take away from the pharmacists that are in those chain pharmacies, because they're doing a really difficult job because they have different metrics, frankly. Like, the CVSs and Walgreens of the world, they have metrics in terms of how many medications are filled and dispensed. And, if it's a small business owner, they can make that determination on their own. No one's forcing that down their throat. Now, there are performance metrics that were part of a ridiculous program called DIR fees that a lot of pharmacists spent a lot of time trying to meet those performance metrics and did a great job. And yet we're still penalized because the metrics were not set up in a way that were fair. And so that resulted in millions of dollars, billions of dollars being extracted again from the marketplace.
Shocking.
Yeah, right. I mean,
I'm used to that. I'm used to that in the hospital business for sure.
Yeah. And I think the nice thing about like a community pharmacist having a CIN, a clinically integrated network, is that you get a touch point generally every 30 days, unless that patient's on a 90-day fill. That's not happening with your primary care provider. So if someone's having issues with respect to their blood pressure, and they're coming in to get their refill in 30 days, and they say to the pharmacist, I'm just still not feeling real well on this medication, they can take the patient's blood pressure right there. And that saves a visit to perhaps, an emergency room. So there is a huge cost savings, I think, to the overall system by having pharmacists be an integral part of the healthcare team.
Great point. Great point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was looking on your website and I see you guys have a pharmacy locator for independent pharmacies. And I think I remember a little while ago seeing an initiative between NCPA and some academic institution for tracking pharmacy deserts. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about pharmacy deserts and how independent pharmacies are trying to be a part of that solution.
Yeah, for sure. So we undertook, and we're still working on it. We just received our second round of funding to sort of update the program. But we have undertaken an initiative with the University of Southern California, two researchers there, Dima Cato and Robert Voss. And what we've done is we've defined what are, I think, more realistic parameters around what equates a desert, whether it be a food desert, a pharmacy desert. The government has their standards, but they're not really, I think, realistic in the sense of like, if you live in a rural area and you have a pharmacy 10 miles away, I still think you're in a desert if you don't have a car. And so like we've worked with them to redefine what actually equates a desert. And DEMA has done a ton of work on this, both in communities in Chicago and Los Angeles. And we worked with them to do a study nationwide on pharmacy deserts. And what we've seen is about 40% of communities across the country live in a pharmacy desert. And it varies by state, whether it's rural or urban. Like, for example, Ohio has more of a percentage of deserts in urban areas than they do rural areas. It's not like that in other states. But what it has told us is that there are certain things, and I think we need to continue the research to really like prove this out. But there are certain metrics that the pharmacy benefit managers use to reimburse independent pharmacies that make it difficult to actually operate a pharmacy in certain rural and urban areas. Either it's the patient population mix that causes the pharmacies to get assessed higher fees, like when the retroactive DIR fees were still a thing. Rural areas, kind of the same thing. If people are not picking up their medications when they're supposed to, or if they're more transient, maybe they live part of the year in Michigan and part of the year in Florida, the pharmacies were getting dinged with a fee because the patient didn't come and pick up their medication, even though that the PBM knows that every year they go to Florida for 6 months. And it's things like that that made it really difficult, or make it really difficult, to operate a pharmacy in certain areas of our country. And, I think the work that we've done really shows that deserts are a problem. I mean, we have food deserts in our country, we have pharmacy deserts in our country.
Yeah.
And I think they're both the result of a lack of antitrust enforcement, frankly, because it has allowed so much consolidation in those two industries that so few large companies control the marketplace that they can determine whether or not you can operate as a small business in certain markets.
Yeah.
They're gatekeepers to patients, they're gatekeepers to suppliers. And so, we're really like putting the welfare of our country in the hands of so few companies now that I think it's very problematic.
We're getting deserts in our old businesses too, in maternity care, actually. Now that you
Absolutely.
mention it,
Yeah.
So speaking of PBMs and regulatory, I know you guys have been advocates, and you pointed that out, and all of a sudden people are talking about PBMs in Congress, and even presidential candidates are talking about going after quote unquote big pharma. But as we've learned on this program through our great speakers, is that, there's a tremendous consolidation, to your point, in all aspects of this supply chain in pharmacy. And like probably most people, I used to blame the manufacturers, like, oh, it's all their fault. They're ripping us off. But then I realized there's tremendous consolidation on the supply side of their suppliers. They give them the raw products. And then there's consolidation in the distribution chain to the pharmacies themselves. And then, of course, from the employer's perspective, we have health plans, and we have to deal with the PBMs, and all those middle folks are taking a lot of the money. And I heard you say something on a panel about consolidation even worse than I thought. So I know PBMs control 90% of the drug market, but in some markets, it's even worse than that. So could you just expand and comment on what I've just alluded to and how that's made it so challenging for the independent pharmacists?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the heart of the issue in retail pharmacy and for independent pharmacies is that vertical consolidation in our industry has led to incentives for the likes of CVS Health, United Health, Cigna, to utilize their vertically consolidated PBMs, Caremark, Aetna, Optum, and Express Scripts, really to extract massive amounts of money from the healthcare system at the expense of patients and pharmacies and other businesses that compete with those companies at some point within the vertical. And if you look at certain communities, health insurance is inherently state-based. And so when you have a look at the marketplace within a particular state, you're going to see that each state has basically one or two dominant health insurers. And that might be okay from an insurance perspective. I don't really know. I'm not going to pontificate on that. I doubt it is good. But when you have two predominant insurers, now that they're all vertically integrated, that means you also have two predominant PBMs in most cases. I grew up in Michigan. There is a town in Michigan that has a single PBM that has just an incredibly high percentage of market share in the commercial space, Jackson, Michigan. I think a single PBM has over 80% market share in the commercial space. So think about that from a small business perspective and a pharmacy owner perspective. I own a pharmacy in Jackson, Michigan, and I want to, have patients that have health insurance come to my store. And so I'm maybe a new owner and I'm like, okay, let me go sign up to be in network for these patients. And I look around and I'm like, okay, there's basically one provider, one PBM for all of these insured patients. And I get the contract and it has obscure language. I can't tell how much I'm going to be reimbursed for every medication that I dispense. It's got very onerous provisions. If I ever want to challenge anything, like I might have to go to arbitration and pay crazy fees to like get access to the arbitration. They have rights to my data. I'm basically like, this is an agreement that no normal business would ever sign. But if I want to have access to these patients, I have to sign it. And so often is the case that pharmacies are basically left with no choice and they have to sign these agreements. And the PBMs know this because they know how much market power they have in these communities. And they offer just ungodly onerous provisions and oftentimes under reimburse the pharmacy because they know they don't want that competitor in their marketplace. They would rather patients use their mail order, or in the case of CVS, maybe the CVS mail order or the CVS brick and mortar. And so that's why they do it. They are gatekeepers. It's kind of like if you think about like the App Store and you have these sort of IT platform situations where if you want to get into the marketplace, you have to go either on the Apple platform or go into the Google platform to get your app out there in the marketplace. So Google and Apple can kind of set the terms, right? There's only two places to go to get your app in the marketplace. And then on the other side, you have clients or customers who want to get access to those apps. And the only place they can go is to the Apple App Store or the Google App Store. Healthcare is set up the same way. If you're a patient and you want to get access to a pharmacy, you have to go where your pharmacy benefit manager tells you. You want to get access to a certain medication, you have to take the medication that your pharmacy benefit manager says is okay to take because they are getting a rebate to put it on a formulary. If you want to get a certain medication and you're in sort of your high deductible phase of your insurance, you have to pay what the pharmacy benefit manager tells you to pay at that retail site for your medication. Or what might happen is the pharmacy benefit manager might say, hey, why don't you use our mail order? I can save you your copay or somewhat on your co-insurance because they can charge less sometimes. And we've seen cases where they actually charge more, but sometimes they'll say, hey, we're going to charge you less here so that you can get a better deal than if you go to this retail pharmacy that we don't really want competing with us and we don't want in our network. And that's how they move market share. It's pretty bad.
Yeah. Matt, every time I hear this part of the conversation, the hair in the back of my neck stand up because, I'm a private practice physician and I ran an orthopedic management company that went under contract with Dr. Rodas when he was president of the hospital. And if we ever use the word control in those documents, ever, we would be brought to task. And yet, this amounts to coercion, extortion. It's just, how did it get this way, Matt? I mean, I understand there was a sense that vertical integration would bring economies of scale, but I mean, it's so far gone. How did it get this way? Was FTC asleep?
I think what it was is that there was a theory of how to interpret our antitrust laws that came about in the late 1970s from Robert Borg. And at that time, there was enough competition in our marketplace where you could actually see through some consolidation, efficiencies start to happen. But I think what happened is over time, over 40 years, where you had really both parties, Democrats and Republicans alike, buying into this consumer welfare standard, you saw essentially an open book when it came to consolidation. Because from an economist's perspective, you can pretty much always make the argument that if you bring two entities together, they're going to find these efficiencies, and ultimately that will result in lower prices for the consumer. And we did see that. I'm very certain we saw that for many, many years. But that was when I think stakeholder capitalism was much more of a thing. Right now, we're just basically seeing shareholder capitalism. And so you have all of this consolidation, and then you have this shift from stakeholder to shareholder capitalism, where these big companies are really just driven by the bottom line. They don't really care about the stakeholders that they're interacting with. And so I think what's happened is really the pendulum has swung too far. And now we have 40 years of data to show that maybe the consumer welfare standard isn't all that it's cracked up to be. I think there are still some good aspects to it. But I think what we need to do is we need to look at, did we allow for too much consolidation? Is there not enough competition in the marketplace to drive down costs? Think of it this way. If the PBMs were doing their job, the federal government would not need to step in to negotiate drug prices.
Right.
And you have folks on the right saying, this is ridiculous. The government shouldn't be in setting drug prices. But at the same time, those sort of conservative theories is what's led to this consolidation in the marketplace that has ultimately resulted in the government having to do something. Now, I think, honestly, like that should just be a very short-term solution. And the long-term solution should be enforce your antitrust laws, bring in more competition to the marketplace, and then the government can get out of the marketplace and allow competition to drive down those costs. I think that's a better solution.
It's worked in other industries. My dad worked for NYNEX, a telephone company in New York, and then it was Bell Telephone. If you remember, they were sued and had to divest and develop all the small communication companies. So it can be done.
Yeah, no, that's a good analogy. I was thinking of the turn of the century, turn of the last century, and where John D. Rockefeller had 90% of the kerosene market, which was heated homes and lit homes. Look what happened after that. I mean, that kind of, you had that mega consolidation in those several markets of railroads and the coal and oil, and eventually the government stepped in. So I'm not usually one to think the government's going to solve this problem, but in this case, indeed, we might need the government to step in. And by the way, the hospital business has been the same thing, right? We've consolidated. Now you got these big health systems, and there's been not really a lot of efficiency and cost savings. They just extracted higher prices from the payers. For the consumers, when I say payers, I mean the people actually paying the bills, which are employers and people. They've just extracted higher prices by leveraging their strength. So it's kind of similar. But let's shift maybe to price transparency. You would think in a free market economy, price transparency should help if people had the freedom, of course, to shop. And you've already made the point that patients don't always have the freedom because their PBM could dictate it. And again, I'm more familiar with the hospital space. If I know my competitor is getting, $25,000 for a joint replacement and I'm only getting $20,000, I'm going to say, hey, I want $25,000 too. So it might actually lead to inflation, not downward pressure on the pricing. Could you comment on price transparency and how that influences all of this?
Yeah, I'd say price transparency is one component of it, but it's not going to be the end-all solution. I think you can look at other markets like the airline industry where you see price transparency and there's competition. I mean, thankfully, the FTC stepped in and stopped some of the mergers that were proposed in the last couple of years, because that competition really does help keep prices down. And there's price transparency. Consumers can see exactly what they're paying for and they can shop. I think the problem with price transparency is being the sole solution. I think it is a part of the solution in our industry is, again, consumers can't shop all that much with respect to where they obtain their drugs. Sure, you can choose a CVS versus a Walgreens versus an independent versus a mail order, but ultimately that market is defined by a single entity, and that's your PBM that works for your health plan. And so until we're able to figure out a way that really allows folks to shop and obtain the medications from entities that they want, I think transparency is only going to be one part of the solution.
Can you talk a little bit? We've seen an increased amount of scrutiny and a heavy amount of scrutiny on PBMs, especially from federal level, the recent congressional testimony with the big three PBM CEOs. But to my knowledge, I haven't seen any big federal level legislation that's really gotten across the finish line, even though there seems to be bipartisan support. And of course, that's not the only approach to solutions here. So could you just tell us a bit about kind of what is going on in terms of PBM reform, maybe the FTC's inquiry, if there's litigation or enforcement from the state attorneys general or insurance commissioners, or legislation at state and federal levels? I know that's a lot of things, but just any highlights of that reform movement?
Yeah. So I'd say that if there's one thing that's brought the political parties together in our country is the dislike for pharmacy benefit managers. We have bipartisan support on 3 bills pending in Congress right now that would, I think, have a profound impact on independent pharmacies, on competition, and really make a much more viable marketplace. And, we're hopeful that those bills, which I think passed out of committee, bipartisan basis with very few objections. My colleague Ann Cassidy is actually our lobbyist, so this is really more her space, but I think that if those pass, that will really set the path for future and an additional legislation around PBMs and really starting to change the marketplace so that competition is better and the playing field is more level. And so, I think there's a good chance that those bills could pass. We've undertaken an initiative called Finish the Fight, where we've reached out to folks and educated consumers on the role that pharmacy benefit managers play. And I think there's been over 30,000 patient letters that have been sent to Congress as a result of our efforts to help get this legislation passed. So I think there is some things on the horizon that can really start to change the role that pharmacy benefit managers play in controlling the marketplace. From a regulatory perspective, the FTC has done a tremendous amount of work, and we're really appreciative of the leadership that Chair Khan has shown in our space. She's done a number of roundtables. She spoke at our convention. Commissioner Bedoya has attended a couple of roundtables, one in Tennessee with Attorney General Scrimetti, one up in Philadelphia where assistant attorney generals from their AG's office visited with us that day too. And so the FTC they're really looking at this industry with a microscope. And even the new commissioners, Commissioner Ferguson and Holyoke, we've had meetings with them, and they seem very interested in these issues and trying to solve them. I think they could also be very good partners in figuring out how to level the playing field and allow for more competition and better prices for consumers.
Matt, we all look at these problems through a different lens, and being a surgeon, I tend to look at it through a very surgical lens. That is, you have a problem, you cut it out. It's that easy. So, when I read the J&J claim, Lewandowski, the first 30 pages, I said, this is a slam dunk, right? It's over for the PBM. It just was written so perfectly. It's got to be over, right? Not so easy. Talk about transparency and regulation. And then I hear that there are some unintended consequences. Premiums could go up. It's not quite that easy. What are your thoughts on the so-called unintended consequences of policy regulations and other types of restrictions?
Yeah, one of the most wonderful things about our country is that states are the incubators by which we try new things around regulation and legislation and things of that nature. And we've seen some really good things come out of state governments, Arkansas, Oklahoma, where they try to rein in, the activities of the PBMs and create a better marketplace, a more competitive marketplace. And what we've seen is that rates really haven't gone up. And if you look at the profits of these huge vertically consolidated entities, and they say, oh, well, if you do this, rates are going to go up. That's just a money grab on their part. And it's an easy thing to say to a member of Congress or a representative in a state, because it's like, well, I don't want to be a part of raising rates. I don't want to pass this because that's going to raise rates. But it's really just a choice by those companies to allow for either stakeholder capitalism or shareholder capitalism, and they're choosing their shareholders every time. They don't need to raise rates. I think it's just a complete hoax when they say that stuff.
Yeah, no, and the citizens, taxpayers, employers, employees are paying the bill at the end of the day.
I mean, look at the studies done in Washington and Florida, where these entities just extracted so much from state governments and taxpayers. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. People are, we've said it many times on the show, but, people make the mistake when we say the word payer. I think people think of, Blue Cross United and Cigna and Aetna and Humana, but no, the payers are us.
Yeah.
Either as employees paying premiums, co-pays, deductibles, as employers paying premiums, as states employees, as taxpayers paying Medicaid and Medicare. We're the ones at the end of the day paying the bill. So if I could, I'm not totally convinced in my mind that the situation is actually going to get better. I hate to say it, but because I'm seeing some of the new entrants into the marketplace. And when I say better, I mean for independent pharmacies in particular, because some of the new entrants, do they really help you or not? Things like Mark Cuban's in this space, or companies like Capital RX, or some of these new, and we have one in Stevestown, of local little apothecaries that dispense generic drugs, cash only. Are those good things for your industry or bad things, or how do you see that going forward?
I think that any sort of disruption like that is going to be a good thing. There might be some short-term pain points, but I think ultimately, whenever you see innovation in a space like ours, it has to be welcome. We have talked to a number of really, I don't know how to describe it, people who really understand the role that a pharmacy benefit manager should play. And they think about it in terms of like, how am I going to help the communities that I'm in? And they are able to save payers, which are usually the employers and local governments, a lot of money and still provide a really good service. And so the more that entities like that can enter the marketplace, the better. The problem is when you have an entrant like that into the marketplace, they still have to rely upon these big consolidated entities because those entities are the insurer, which often controls the data.
Right.
And so like if you're wanting to like get access to any of those insured lives as a competitor PBM, that insurance company, I've been told, will charge you a premium on the data that you need to be able to do real-time checks on eligibility and then on the medication tier for a particular patient. So oftentimes those entities will go in and they'll underbid the vertically consolidated PBM, but when they get tacked on the cost of that data feed, it pushes them right out of competition. And that to me seems very anti-competitive. And it should be something that is looked into by regulators, AGs, and the like. But overall, the answer to your question is I think those things are good things. I understand Mark Cuban is now going to a cost plus where they pay $12 in dispensing fees. The transparency around the acquisition cost, I think, is vital. And I think overall it's going to be a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, Matt, that's a great response. And, time goes so fast on these podcasts. So we like to sort of wrap up by asking, and John and I live for bright spots. We've been doing various value-based initiatives since 2007, and it gets a bit depressing sometimes. But, but the way we deal with it, there are wins, right? You got to live for those wins. And
there are medications for that, Steve. We're talking, this is a pharmacy call after all. You got to go talk to your local pharmacist.
I may have to try those gummy bears. I don't know, but I heard some potential bright spots at the state level, the state attorney generals. You named a few states in your panel discussion. I think that's something we can cling to. Federal government moves a little bit slower, and then these independent pharmacies. Your colleague Luke Slindy, we asked him this question, and he said, that 90% of prescription drugs are generic, and if you have these private independent pharmacies, I have two now that popped up in West Hartford. If you can provide them with low cost generics, it gives them these new entrants a chance to pick up and stuff. So from your perspective, your lens, looking at the next 3 to 5 years, where are the bright spots and where do you think we're going to end up?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think the bright spot is always going to be the pharmacist, the pharmacy owner. These are folks that care desperately about their communities. They know their communities, they love their patients, and they really take care of them. That is now and it always will be the bright spot, I think, of community pharmacy. I think the bright spot in terms of competition is that I think we will see, given the bipartisan support, we will see new legislation. I think we will see some enforcement actions out of regulators against the anti-competitive behavior of some of these PBMs. And I think that will have an impact on the marketplace that will level the playing field and allow for, more small businesses to thrive. I'm confident that that will happen. You're seeing a populist movement in the Republican Party that is very supportive and aligns very well with people on the left in terms of antitrust enforcement. And I think if they can come together, we could really have some activities that will help communities and help some of these small businesses stay open. And I think both parties are committed to that.
Thank you for that response. I think we're certainly very supportive of that. As we started today, we know that pharmacists are amongst the most trusted folks in the healthcare ecosystem by their patients. And I think we all would like to have that local pharmacist who knows us and knows what we're taking. And I harken back to the days when growing up in a kind of a smaller place in New Jersey where this is back when people wrote prescriptions and the patient would hand the prescription to the pharmacist, would look at it, he'd try to interpret the handwriting, he would say, do you have a cold or cancer? Because and the patient said, I have a cold. So, okay, I know what this is then. So we're big fans. And I'll just close with one other point. I've heard of the CEO of one of those big poker players, I won't say who, when they asked him a question, what keeps you up at night? He had a one-word answer: disintermediation. Because exactly breaking up this, kind of monopoly in all sides of the healthcare ecosystem would be the ultimate disruptor. And I think you're right. So, Matt, we thank you very much
Yeah,
for
thank
joining
you.
us today. And Laura and Steve, of course, thank you for your questions and comments. It's always great to have us all here. And Matt, I hope you have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciated the questions.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, take care, guys.
Thanks, Matt. We want to take a minute now to introduce the new MTVA membership program. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely on support from our grassroots network to advance our mission of creating a value-based health system with high-quality patient outcomes at a reasonable cost. As we continue to grow and broaden our impact, we're excited to invite like-minded organizations and individuals to join our membership program. We're proud to offer two membership models, Ally Member and Trade Member. Tax-deductible membership contributions help us enrich the healthcare environment with quality content, including this podcast, and robust platforms to fuel discussion, collaboration, and advocacy that lead to groundbreaking solutions. For more information, including a full list of benefits offered, visit our website at www.movingtovalue.org/trade-member. The link is also in the episode description. Thanks again for listening and for being part of this important movement.